Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Now we are going to ignore the pile of clothes that are behind me because I've just got back from a wedding and haven't properly unpacked yet. But I really needed to get this video filmed before October and we are quickly running out of time. But I am back today to talk about my most anticipated releases for the months of October to December. I always love having a browse through different publishing catalogues and hearing on social media all of the different books that are due to come out, so I like to keep a little list and let you know about them. And because there are quite a few, let's just get straight into those books. First off, coming out on the 5th of October, we have A History of Women in 101 Objects by Annabelle Hirsch. And this looks really, really good. I had previously read A History of the World in 100 Objects, which was a general history, I think, focused mainly on objects that you can find in the British Museum and the history around them and their significance, and I really enjoyed reading that. This seems to take a similar basic concept, but puts it through a female lens, looking at different objects that exemplify women's experiences from like 30,000 years ago all the way up to present day, and encompassing things that both demonstrate women's suffering as well as women's joy, from thumbscrews used for torture in the medieval period to bicycles to self-help books. Then next, coming out on the 9th of October, we have Lilith by Nikki Marmery. I read Women's Law by Sarah Clegg, which came out at the beginning of this year, which focused on lots of different women that were depicted as demons, monstrous creatures that were depicted as women. And this actually introduced me to the figure of Lilith, Adam's first wife, who was banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying him, who subsequently was seen as this demonic figure, especially in comparison to the more submissive Eve. 18 years of going to Catholic church every Sunday didn't teach me about Lilith, but this book did. And in this book, we've got a feminist fictional retelling of Lilith, bringing Lilith to the forefront, but also bringing forward Eve, as well as God's wife, Ashera. Once again, a figure that I didn't get taught anything about. So I'm really interested in seeing the direction that this takes. Is it going to have like a subversive ending, or is it going to play things pretty straight? Next up, we have the continuation of a series. Coming out on the 12th of October is The Wolves of Winter by Dan Jones. This is the follow-up to The Essex Dogs, which is a book that I read and reviewed last year, focusing on a group of mercenary soldiers who've been hired in the early stages of the 100 Years' War to fight against France. The last book brought us up to the Battle of Crécy, so I imagine that this book is going to be following the aftermath, as well as the Siege of Calais in 1347. In the previous book, the Essex Dogs were really being tested both by their group being separated by the higher-ups, as well as just by the general hysteria and bad behaviour that is spurred on by battle. Warfare, both mentally and physically, testing their endurance. I feel like this is going to be much the same, but maybe digging into these issues a bit deeper and maybe getting a bit darker as well. Also coming out on the 12th of October is The Book at War, Libraries and Their Readers in the Age of Conflict by Andrew Pettegree. I was interested in reading this one because it's written by one of the co-authors of The Library of Fragile History, which I read earlier this year and really enjoyed. This book focuses particularly on war and how war has shaped and influenced literature, but similarly, literature has spurred on or influenced the outcomes of war. This book is looking at authors from Harriet Beecher Stowe to Evelyn Waugh to Anne Frank. From the description, it seems to be saying that it's going from conflicts such as the American Civil War up to Ukraine, so I'm presuming this is definitely just focusing on more modern and contemporary warfare rather than anything earlier. Though I'd be delighted to be wrong about that. It would be very interesting to read more about earlier conflicts and literature. But yeah, this just looks really interesting. We know that I'm not a massive fan of like a military history or anything really to do with war, but I feel like if you throw books and literature in there, then you might be able to entice me. The final book I'm interested in, also coming out on the 12th of October, is Deck the Hall, The Stories of Our Favourite Christmas Carols by Andrew Gant. I'm very keen to read this one as I read 2 Andrew Gant books last year, 5 Straight Lines, A History of Music, as well as his other book on Christmas carols. And to be honest, I'm really keen to see how this one differs from Christmas carols. Is it retreading old ground, or is it going to be providing something new? Is it going to be different carols that are focused on? But either way, I'm really excited because this is looking at the origins of all of our favourite Christmas carols. And I know from reading that previous book that these Christmas carols can often have really surprising origins, many of which were not written with Christmas celebration as their clear intention. One of my favourite lines that comes from the blurb is Andrew Gant's quote of, "Some carols were born to Christmas, some have achieved Christmas, and some have had Christmas thrust upon them." Coming out on the 19th of September, we have The Winter Spirits, Ghostly Tales for Frosty Nights, which is written by a collection of different historical fiction authors. This is a follow-up to a previous short story collection called The Haunting Season, which, as you can imagine, featured more Halloweeny, more spooky gothic stories. This seems to have a similar tone, but very much focused around Christmas, so scary tales for Christmas. And we are seeing stories from Bridget Collins, Imogen Hemis-Gower, Natasha Pulley, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, Andrew Michael Hurley, Jess Kidd, Elizabeth McNeil, Laura Purcell, Susan Stokes Chapman, Laura Shepherd Robinson, Stuart Turton and Katrina Ward. Basically a roster of all of the most influential historical fiction writers writing at the moment. Also coming out on the 19th of October is Cities of Women by Kathleen B. Jones. This presents a dual narrative between modern day and the 15th century, in which we're seeing this history professor trying to identify the artist behind the illustrations of Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies. And as she delves more into her life, the two narratives start to kind of bleed into one another and start to echo each other. Both this artist from the 15th century and this history professor from modern day struggling to have people take them seriously, and their passions for history and art start to overwhelm them. Once again, a reminder to me that I still haven't read any Christine de Pizan, even though I seem to be increasingly more interested in her. So probably I need to read Christine de Pizan and then read this. Next up, also coming out on the 19th of October, is Julia by Sandra Newman, which is a retelling of 1984. I've never actually read an Orwell retelling before, and this one is focused on the character of Julia. And it does seem to be pretty much retreading the old ground from 1984, just from a different perspective, perhaps with a more feminist lens, while still being respectful of the original story. I'd be very, very interested to see the conversation around this one, because I know how passionate people get about George Orwell. Coming out on the 26th of October is Normal Women, 900 Years of Making History by Philippa Gregory. Philippa Gregory is of course most well known for her fiction, particularly focused on the Tudors, and here we've got a non-fiction offering from her. It'd be very interesting if the first Philippa Gregory that I ever read ended up being non-fiction, and I think this book is really going to be trying to fill in the gaps for ordinary women where they are not often included in the historical record, whether that is left out or written out, and really trying to reevaluate the popular perception of what women's place was in society. I think people have a very 19th century Victorian idea of like the angel in the house, of women just being at home, men going out to work, and that's really not what it was like for most women through most of the past. It is very much just this ideal, and it clocks in at over 700 pages, so I feel like it's going to be very thorough indeed, or at the very least treading over a lot of ground. Also coming out on the 26th of October is Love, A Curious History by Edward Brooke-Hitching. You may recognise this name, or at the very least you'll recognise the covers of these books. This is from the author of The Phantom Atlas, The Madman's Library, and he's very well known for doing these illustrated histories. We know I love an illustrated history, basically going through a topic and all of the iconography and imagery that you can find for it over the span of millennia. And in this book we are focusing on love, going from erotic paintings to love letters to marginalia in medieval manuscripts. There are so many different ways that you can show love or love being demonstrated throughout history, despite how popular they are, and despite the fact that I see them all the time in bookshops and think, oh, I'd love to read one of those. I've still not read any of Edward Brooke-Hitching's books, but this might convince me, especially if I think this would be good for a super sexy history book video. Coming out on the 2nd of November is a book that I am very much anticipating, and that is Mary, or The Birth of Frankenstein by Anna Eekhout. You may know how much I love Frankenstein, as well as learning about Frankenstein's author, Mary Shelley. A couple of years ago I read Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, which was a dual biography of Mary Shelley and Mary Wollstonecraft, her mother, and I really loved learning more about these two fantastic women. I also read Love and Fury by Samantha Silver at the beginning of last year, which was a fictional retelling of Mary Wollstonecraft's life, so it was only right that I would want to read a fictional retelling of Mary Shelley's life, of course. Rather than Love and Fury, which was going through all of Mary Wollstonecraft's life, this is placing us very much in Mary Shelley's teenage years, looking at her relationship to Isabella Baxter, whose family she was staying with, and then also flitting forward to 1816 when she starts writing Frankenstein, and maybe some of the memories from 1812 that might be helping her unlock this character and this story. Coming out on the 7th of November is Checkmate by Ali Hazelwood. You know that I really enjoy an Ali Hazelwood romance, and she is very much a Marmite hit or miss author, but so far I've really enjoyed the books by Ali Hazelwood that I've read, even though there are definitely tropes that do get repeated over and over. For me, I don't mind too much, but I think it's probably beneficial for me to read Ali Hazelwood books as they come out, rather than reading them all in one binge, because otherwise you do start to notice those tropes again and again. I will say though, I feel like the main characters in this book are maybe her most ridiculous. We have Mallory Greenleaf, who is a chess player, and she's coming up against Nolan Sawyer. These names, oh my god. Competing against each other, antagonising each other, but could it actually be the tension is love? We know how these stories play out, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to enjoy every bit of it. A slightly different history for me is is Eyeliner, A Cultural History by Zahra Hankir. You might be able to see from my makeup on today that I am quite a bit of an eyeliner fan. In fact, one of the managers at my job actually uses the fact that I wear eyeliner as kind of like her descriptor for me. When she was trying to point me out to her daughter, she was like, Charlotte's the one with the eyeliner. And it's one of those things, like, I know that I wear a full face of makeup. I know that most people don't, or at least a lot of people don't. But because I know what I look like in makeup and without makeup, I don't really notice anything. I don't really think it's that noticeable. But apparently other people do. And despite being two loves of mine, I've never actually read a book that actually meshes my love of history and makeup. Even though I know that there are definitely some influential books that have done, like War Paint. Maybe Eyeliner is my gateway in. This book says that it's going from Nefertiti to Amy Winehouse, looking at the impact of eyeliner, how it can be transformative, beautifying, but also really fun. This is very much a world history going through thousands of years. And yeah, I just think it'd be really interesting. Coming out on the 16th of November is The Modern Venus, Dress, Underwear and Accessories in the Late 18th Century Atlantic World by Elisabeth Gernerd. Similar kind of track to the eyeliner book, really. In this we are looking, instead of makeup history, at clothing history, but particularly, as the title suggests, on undergarments. I'm a big fan of reading about dress history, but I've never read a book that looks at undergarments. I've been trying to steer away from reading blurbs, but I feel like I do just need to read the top of this for you. From rumps and stays to muffs and handkerchiefs, underwear and accessories were critical components of the 18th century woman's wardrobe. They not only created her shape, but expressed her character, sociability, fashionability, and even political allegiances. These so-called ephemeral flights of fashion were not just peripheral and supplementary, but highly charged artifacts, acting as cultural currency in contemporary society. And I think it's something that we don't really tend to think about, especially with our modern clothing choices, just how significant what was going on under, like, your top layer of clothing actually was, moulding you into a fashionable shape, rather than trying to morph a body into being a fashionable shape through diet and exercise. You could kind of cheat your way to that fashionable silhouette through your underclothing. You know, I've known about that, but actually learning more about, like, political allegiances, the kind of political statements that you could be making with your undergarments and accessories, I just think that would be really, really fun to learn more about. The final book that I'm going to talk to you about today is one that you know I've been very heavily anticipating. It is the final book in a trilogy, and it is The Temple of Fortuna by Elodie Harper, coming out on the 23rd of November. This is the third book in the Wolf Den trilogy. I will pop down below my review of the second book in this series, The House with the Golden Door, which I really thoroughly enjoyed. In fact, I actually thought it was better than the first book, The Wolf Den, which was already a pretty great book. So you might imagine my anticipation for The Temple of Fortuna is very, very high indeed. And the trouble is that I can't really go much into the blurb of this without spoiling the previous books in the series. But The Wolf Den was focusing on the character of Amara, who was a sex worker working in a brothel in Pompeii, working and fighting hard to get her freedom, and her relationships with the other women in the brothel, and basically living on the hard streets of Pompeii, what it's like to be on the lower rungs of society, as opposed to what we often see when Pompeii is portrayed, which is the wealthy elites. The original book started off, I think, in 76 AD, and this book is taking place in 79 AD. And if you know your Pompeii history, you know that something is on the horizon, something rather tall and maybe a little bit explosive. I wonder what's going to happen. The tension is high. But there we go. Those are all of the books that I am very much anticipating for October to December, even though there weren't actually any December books here, because of course the publishing industry does tend to wind down a little bit in December. But please, I would love to know any books that you've been looking forward to that I haven't mentioned today, anything that you would particularly recommend. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.